This is actually the last part of our series, so we are at the very end of the Crash Course in Jewish Life Cycle. It's been a meaningful series. We're going to thank Story Stone for sponsoring the series. We're going to be learning a little bit today about the conclusion of the cycle, which is Kaddish, tombstones, and yahrzeit. So this is really the end of an entire cycle. We've started birth, we moved all the way through some of the major parts of life, and then we come to, I guess, the end of the year of Velos, and perhaps going forward from that which is Kaddish and the yahrzeit as well. So the question is like just to start off at the very, very beginning, is what is the value of saying Kaddish? Like why do people say Kaddish? So the truth is that there are a number of reasons. The most famous reason that you will hear is a story about that appears in a midrash. It's a very hard midrash to track down. It's quoted in the Tzror Hamor. He has the full text of it, and in it it's a description of how Rabbi Akiva has some sort of image or dream about a person who comes who's carrying sticks in the world to come. It's clearly a soul in the world to come, and this person is like working assiduously without break. And Rabbi Akiva asks him, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm being punished for the life I led in this world." And he goes on to say, "Well, what can we do about this? It's a terrible situation." So he says, "Well, it's because I did all kinds of terrible things." And he goes on to describe all the terrible things that he did in this world. Rabbi Akiva says, "Well, do you have any heirs? Do you have any children?" So he says, "Well, I don't know." He says, "I know that when I passed away, I left this lady pregnant, but I don't know what happened." And so Rabbi Akiva made it his duty to go find, and he went all over the world to try to find this person, and he finds out, and in the meantime, everybody who hears about this fellow rejects this man, completely terrible person. He did all these types of terrible things, and he finally tracks down this child. This child's unschooled, unlettered, and he takes him in and teaches him how to say Aleph Beis, and then finally teaches him how to say the words Yehei Shmei Rabban Vorach, that Hashem's great name should be blessed. And when he teaches this child to be able to say this fellow comes back to him in a dream and says, "You relieved me of some of the discomfort that I was going through, the punishment that I was going through in the world to come because of the life that I led as well." So that's what this midrash says. And as a function of that, generally speaking, Kaddish is associated with that. Kaddish is where a son is being able to say on behalf of a deceased parent to lessen the load of the sin that was done. That's the way that Kaddish is generally understood. However, that's not the only way it's understood as well. It's also important some of the Mepharshim explain that it's also a notion of what's called tziduk hadin. What is tziduk hadin? Tziduk hadin is said, as we learned a little bit last time, 2 times ago at the funeral, is a set of statements which are there to say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I don't understand it, but you're running the world, and I agree with the way you're running the world. So Kaddish is, in a certain sense, that expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, your name, the way you run this world should be expanded. I get it. There's a plan. There's something that's going on. You're in charge, and that's what seems to be going on also in the Kaddish as well. So there's another element to that. So one is creating as chus. The other one is tziduk hadin. But there's another element of it as well, which is that the Kaddish itself is a will, an aspiration to bringing more Kaddish into this world. In fact, the words Yiskadal v'Yiskadash, which are the only Hebrew words in Kaddish, right? Because the rest of it is Shmei Rabbah, already is Aramaic. Baal Madi Rachi Rusei is all Aramaic, right? So the Yiskadal v'Yiskadash itself actually is a pasuk in Yechezkel, which describes how HaKadosh Baruch Hu his name is going to be enlarged and going to sanctify this world. So we're talking about trying to fill a void, a vacuum in this world with Hashem's name. That's what a person's trying to do. And part of the way one does this is by everybody saying together, Yesh Mei Rabban Vorach L'Olam Amel Maya, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, your name should be eternally magnified. And that is itself, so to speak, a mission. So therefore, you leave shul afterwards in the morning. You say, "Okay, That's it. Let's go. Those are the marching orders. So what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? In it itself is a Kiddush Hashem, but also it's also a mission to a Kiddush Hashem as well. In fact, I would say so much so, to me, the hardest word in all of Kaddish, is Bara'ava. So let's listen to the words for a second. It goes, Yiskadal v'yiskadal shmei rabbah. God's magnified and sanctified be thy holy name. If one wants to follow Leonard Cohen's translation. Then Ba'alma, in the world, Divra, that you created Chirusei. What's Chirusei? As you wanted it. As you willed it. That's the hard word. And you should rule over your world as you created it in your will. The problem is that when you look outside, the world is not Kirusei. The world that we see is not the world that God intended to be created in His will, because there's a lot of mess out there. There's a lot of problems and lack of integrity and lack of alignment to the divine plan. I think that part of what Kaddish is saying is we're trying to align the world more with that than what we see. That the difference between what is and what ought to be is what the Kaddish seems to be addressing. And that's the case. Why does that relate to saying it for a person during the 12 months and at the yahrzeit? Is very simply is because then what we're saying is that this person's absence is part of the vacuum in the world. That's the gap between what should be and what is in the world. So I'm trying to acknowledge that there needs to be more good, more holiness, more sanctification in the world as a function of the absence of this person. That's also part of what's being said as well. So a lot of different pieces that relates to the Kaddish. There's all kinds of things. There's also, if anybody is interested in this, it actually relates to Parsha Shlach, because it says V'ata yigdal na koyach Hashem, that Moshe Rabbeinu in this terrible chilul Hashem that was created, where Hashem said, you're going into the land of the people, and then the people come back and say, well, not so fast, not exactly, HaKadosh Baruch, I'm not sure you've considered all everything over. Yeah, there's big people, there's big fruit, there's, and Eri's like, oh my gosh, HaKadosh Baruch, how could you do this to us? And Eri starts crying, right? So that's a really big chilul Hashem, right? God said yes, we said no, and it's really like a pretty embarrassing moment for humanity, certainly in the nation of Israel. So after that Kaddish Baruch Hu says, okay, clearly you guys are not going to be my ambassadors into the land of Israel, right? We're going to retire this generation. We're going to figure out the next folks who speak the right language. So, but after this happens, then Hashem says, Ata yigdal na koach Hashem. Now let the strength of Kaddish Baruch Hu be magnified. And in fact, so just Kabbalistically speaking, koach means strength or potential. And koach has 28 letters. So that's why it is that there's 28 words in Kaddish. Now, if you count, it's not exactly 28. But the way it goes is actually from Yehei Shmei Rabbah to the end of the second paragraph is 28. And that's why during the Yom, let's just see just quickly. Should we do an experiment quickly and just make sure we got it? Because everybody always does these things, and then let's make sure we got it. So it goes Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevorach Leolam Ulmei Olmayos. That's 6. Yisparach v'ishtabach v'yispar v'yisramam v'yisnasei v'yisadar v'yisale v'yisalal shmei dekurusha brich hu le'ela min kol birchasa v'shirasa tishbuchasa nechmasa damiron ba'alma. Okay, that's the 28. That's the 28 words from Yehei Shmei Rabbah to the end of the second paragraph. That's Ata, now in the absence, in the terrible humiliation of God's name. Yigdal na koach Hashem, the 28, the power of Hashem is going to be magnified, and that's what we're doing every time. So we think about all the Meraglim episodes in our lives where Hashem says, you really should be doing this, and we said, God, we think we should be doing that. Right, so that's a lot of our lives. So then we say Kaddish to kind of sort of bring that back. So in that, that's why it is during the Yom Noraim, and during Aseret Tshuva, what do? We change one of those words to la'ela, right? We say above and above, right? Ascendant and ascendant. But the problem is that interrupts the equilibrium of 28, which is why we change the words then. When we do la'ela, it's mikol, not minkol. So we merge two words to still have that 28, which is the Ata Yigdal Na Koach Hashem. Okay, anyway, there's lots of stuff going on there. There's lots of the moving pieces that seems to be happening. Nonetheless, that's the Kaddish as well. Who is obligated to say the Kaddish? So based on that medrash, it sounds like Rabbi Akiva was looking for a son. In fact, when he was having the discussion with the soul said, "I don't know if it's going to be a boy or a girl," and that seemed to be in the mind of the soul, at least. It seemed to be that it was a son in charge of this as well. So why is there no sons? So there's a long discussion in halacha. So if there's no sons, a grandson should do this. In fact, somebody yesterday just came to me. Somebody got an aliyah at the Torah yesterday. I said, "Oh, what's the occasion?" He says, "My grandfather's yahrzeit. My father predeceased my grandfather." Right? So he became the person to say the Kaddish for his grandfather. So what happens if there's no grandchildren? So then a brother or husband should be the next in line. If there's no brother or husband, then the son-in-law. If there's no son-in-laws, then another relative should say Kaddish. That's the general, so to speak, triage. Although there are somewhat disputes, but that's the general triage. What if there are no relatives to say Kaddish? Nabach, there's situations where there are people who don't have any children, any relatives to say Kaddish. So in that case, one should ask somebody else to do it, but not just ask, one should actually hire. So it's halachically speaking, it's appropriate to hire somebody to say Kaddish as well. And there are many wonderful people who do this. So I know through the Davis Memorial Fund locally, the National Association of Kaddish in Queens, they have people who do this. And these are like people in Kollel who could use a little bit of extra salary or davening well, and they will take upon themselves the name, and they will say at the beginning of the day that my Kaddish is today will the Ilu Nishmas, Avram ben Terach, whoever they're saying it for, and that will be and then they'll say the Kaddishes for that person that day. And the financial aspect of it is a certain guarantee, because when it's a volunteer, volunteers are volunteers, right? They come and they go. And but when it comes to somebody's being paid, there's you're now taking away money if you're not doing your job, as well. And it's interesting that a person who let's say can be hired multiple times. It doesn't have to be that one person is hired for one Kaddish. A person can actually say multiple Kaddish. There's no concern even in halacha for this at all, except if the person is saying Kaddish for their own. So let's say a person is in the middle of their year. Then it's less appropriate for them to take on somebody else as well while they're doing their own Kaddish. But as a person who's doing it for multiple other people, that's all right as well. So that in terms of the Kaddish as well, and this comes up from time to time. Sometimes people do this as well when they just are worried about their travel plans. So they say, like, it's going to be a long year of Kaddish, and I know there's going to be the short winter afternoons with 4:15 shkia, which or 4:30 shkia, which is impossible, right? And especially ones in the middle of the workday and between patients, whatever it is, it's impossible. So people will sometimes hire somebody as well as a net, just so that they don't feel that they're not going to miss things out if they feel like they're the only person as well. Can daughters say Kaddish? This is a very big, interesting question in halacha. And there are many poskim who say they shouldn't. The Chavos Yair talks about this in the Piskei Shuvah and suggests practically against it, although technically it's fine. And there are many who say it is all right. It is fine. So you'll see Rav Henkin is quoted in HaParadise as saying that it's fine. It should obviously be in the women's section, not in the men's section. That was a whole discussion in and of itself, because it seemed to be that some people had the practice of coming forward. That was not deemed appropriate. But women may say Kaddish as well, and the only proviso is that a woman should be saying Kaddish when there's a man saying Kaddish as well. So it shouldn't be that she's the only person saying Kaddish in a shul. That's generally the recommendation, and then of course the poskim do say that if a woman is saying Kaddish, she's going to shul, she should dress in a way that's appropriate to a shul. Otherwise, it's causing more pain to the neshama than what the Kaddish should be saying is, which obviously makes sense. But just to put things into perspective. And so what about children under bar mitzvah? So I was the child under bar mitzvah, I said Kaddish for a full year. And that's the halacha, is that children may say Kaddish if they know what they're saying. So if you don't know what you're saying, then it's worthless. But if a child's older than 6, as an example, and they can know what they're saying, then it's sufficient as well. When does one stop saying Kaddish? So this famously, everybody knows this is an 11-month business. Why 11 months? So the reason is because that a soul, when it passes away, undergoes a process of judgment for a period of time, depending on the types of life it led. And that judgment is more intense at the beginning, and it peters away, like it diminishes over the course of that year. That judgment, or the intense judgment, could be up to 12 months. So we try to give as much merit and as much Kiddush Shem Shemayim in that year as possible, but we don't want to make it seem like that person, that parent, in many cases, needed a full 12 months of that cleansing. So what we do is we do up to 11 months and we stop, because that's an acknowledgement we're giving as much as we possibly can, but we don't want to make the assumption that the person needed all 12 months. That would be disrespectful for a child to do Kaddish in such a way. It is worthwhile noting that the Sephardim do it slightly different. The Sephardim go to the 11th month, and then they stop for a week, and then they go back for the last 3 weeks to the yahrzeit. That's a slightly different to the Ashkenazim as well. But it's the same acknowledgement which is being made. Interestingly enough, if one is hired to say Kaddish, or it's not saying Kaddish for a parent, one does the full 12 months. There's a slight debate, but then it's an issue not of Kibbur Avayim then, right? It's not there's no Kibbur Avayim limiting the experience, and so therefore a person would be able to do the full 12 months as well. And it's worthwhile noting that the 12 months is measured from the date of the burial. Okay, so that may be slightly later than the death as well. And that's the general rule about heavy hour. Leap years, we just did this over here. Leap years means to say that if there's a leap year during the year of Avelos, then there's going to be 3 dates, right? Because there's going to be the 11 months at the end of the Kaddish, 12 months at the end of Avelos, and 13 months for the yahrzeit. Okay, because the yahrzeit is an annual thing, and the Kaddish and the Avelos are a month thing. So they would work separately. So there's 3 waystones milestones in that year as well. If there's a leap year, and let's say, and this happens all the time, let's say a person has passed away during an Adar, and it was a regular year, and then comes along the next year or year ahead, and there is an Adar Sheni, so there's a second Adar. So where does the yahrzeit belong? Ashkenazim put it to the first month, and the Sephardim push it to the second month. Okay, so you'll notice different ways of doing this. In Ashkenazi tradition, as Kedar Keinu Kodesh, because there's many opinions, you'll see those who suggest that you should do the observances of the yahrzeit on both. That means to say one should fast on both, for those who fast. One should say Kaddish on both, but one should not kick other people off the Amud for both. So the point is, the primary one is the first one, but you can do additional non-interfering practices on the second one as well. Okay, so that's what some people are makbid on doing, but the predominant practice is the first one for Ashkenazim in terms of the way they do this. Why this is fascinating. If you remember, Rabbi Shai Finkelstein was here a number of months ago at Surah Shlishis. He addressed this particular topic. Very interesting as to why Purims go later if there's two Adars, but Kaddish go earlier if you're Ashkenazic, Bar Mitzvahs go. Yes, it's just interesting how this all works. Okay, there's different rules or different things that happen during a leap year. What about if you have a special birthday and your birthday? The birthdays is separate. But let's say yahrzeit. Okay, so that topic at hand, birthday is separate. But let's say a person has a yahrzeit on the 30th of Cheshvan or the 30th of Kislev. So you say, why is that special? The answer is that doesn't always happen. Because those are the 2 months that sometimes have an extra day of Rosh Chodesh and sometimes don't, which means to say that there sometimes is a 30th and there sometimes isn't a 30th, there's only a 29th. Right? When there's 2 days Rosh Chodesh, like this coming week, then the first day of Rosh Chodesh is the 30th of the previous month and the second day of Rosh Chodesh is the first of the next month. When there's 1 day Rosh Chodesh, that 1 day Rosh Chodesh is the first of the new month, of course, but the previous day was the 29th, there wasn't a 30th. So it happens to be that all the months in our fixed calendar are set except for Cheshvan and Kislev, which sometimes do, sometimes don't. So what happens if there's a yahrzeit on one of those? So it depends on Sephardic or Ashkenazic practice when it comes to this. I know I put this somewhere. I don't remember where I put it. This is about setting the date of the yahrzeit. I apologize. Okay, it's not so much about the Kaddish, but I did put this on later on, and that is the Sephardim commemorate the yahrzeit of the 29th in those years. So they'll do it always the last day. They view it as the last day of the previous month. And so it'll go backwards to a 29th in the year where it's not there, there's no 30th. Ashkenazim say it depends on the first year. If the first year is a male, then in a certain sense, that means say there's 30 days, then it'll be kept on a Rosh Chodesh. So for all future years, it'll be a Rosh Chodesh, even if the Rosh Chodesh happens to be on a first, right? But if the first year is a chaser, in that case, it goes down to the 29th, the day before. So then for the rest of the years, it'll go down to the 29th. So it depends how the first year sets things. Interesting as to that complicates that as well. Now, Yizkar. So Yizkar, when is Yizkar said? So the predominant expression of Yizkar, as is talked about in the earlier poskim, is on Yom Kippur. Why on Yom Kippur? So the reason is because, first of all, it's a time where neshamas themselves are rejudged. Famously, the Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah that Sifrei Chaim is Sifrei Mesim Psuchim and Afanav. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has the books of life and death in front of him. We usually understand that to mean is that we are being judged as to which book we're put in. But Rosh Soloveitchik actually says perhaps it means that the books of those who are alive and the books of those who have been deceased, which is a far larger amount of books, are going to be judged. All people, all souls, here or not here, are being judged. And if they're being judged, we want to do things in their merit so their judgment is more favorable. Right? That's part of what the Yizkor is as well. And also, it's also because when one does this, it's also a humbling experience to think about the fact that we are mortal, and we have a lot of work to be doing ourselves, which is why it's done in Yom Kippur. But in Ashkenazi tradition, it also goes to the last day of Yom Tov as well. So that would be Shmini Atzeres, it should have been Tzichas Torah, but Shmini Atzeres, last day of Shavuos, and last day of Pesach as well. It also appears there. Why? So it's interesting, this is a European practice which appeared, that accompanying practice did not make it down to Spain and the Sephardic Jewry. And part of the reason it's explained in Halacha in the earlier Rishonim 800 years ago is because what's the laning on all those days is Aser Ta'aser, and the last pasuk of Aser Ta'aser, David, is the last pasuk of Aser Ta'aser or Kol HaBechor is. So I'm sorry, putting the Balkar on a. Eliezer? Ish kemat nas yadoi kivir kaz Hashem Elokecha Hashem nasanach. Right. So that's the last pasuk, and in fact, that is seen as the focus of the laning, which is that a person, what's ish kemat nas yadoi kivir kaz Hashem Elokecha Hashem nasanach, is when you come to the Beis HaMikdash, you open up your wallet and you give tzedakah. This is the time you're supposed to give tzedakah, right? And in fact, in a Yekish tradition, they lay that in a higher octave when they're in shul, to emphasize the fact that now's the time to give. If now's the time to give, then let's give for those who aren't here. That's what it became. Is the primary calculus of Yizkor is doing a mitzvah on behalf of the departed, which is the pledge of stock. It's not just the words. The words by themselves are wonderful, but it's about the pledging. That's the point, is by my doing a mitzvah, which I can't do right now, because I can't write the check, but I will do it tonight or tomorrow, I'm accruing merit on the day that I'm supposed to. The Torah says is a day, or Valiyah L'Regel, to do a mitzvah. That's the calculus of how it works, which is why it's the last day of Yom Tov where that laning appears. Okay, so, and it's interesting that merged with the private Yizkor is the public Yizkor, which is as well that over time, Europe has had many opportunities to mourn the loss of many martyrs who've been killed in the name of Christianity and even just good old money. And as a function of that, there was a prayer which was instituted, which was a public Yizkor, which we call Av HaRachamim. Now, Av HaRachamim started appearing during the Sfiras HaOmer, and then around the Crusades time, and then it started being used, and now it's basically on every Shabbos, except for special Shabbos like Shabbos Nevarachim. And that talks about Avraham Yizkor, right? We talk about HaKadosh Baruch Hu remembering the souls of those who are departed, and it's really it's a very powerful prayer, and it is also in a certain sense a public Yizkor. And it goes on to describe those who have been killed in the name of Hashem. And so this is that is the public Yizkor, and we merge the public and the private. So that's why Yizkor is complex. Is the foothold of our experience is the private, the person that we're thinking about, but the public is the amount of people who died over the history, and over time we've added. So there's a Holocaust one, there's an Israeli soldiers one as well. Just after October 7th, the Rabbanim of Efrat composed another one because of the October 7th one to be said Yizkor as well. That's the Yizkor. Yeah, Moshe.
Is Yizkor, can it be said for anyone, or is it only for parents or siblings, etc.?
Good question. So it's anyone in the Zion Krovim, right? So anybody who's in the network of people one would do Avelus for, one is able to say. And there's different titles one can give. The predominant person one starts with is a parent. But if it's any other person, one can certainly say it. There's a tremendous chus in that.
It's obligatory, let's say, for parents. But I mean, if you have a friend and he doesn't have anyone to say yes to,
that's a good question. I don't know. I would say that if a person's already staying in, then they could certainly do that. I wouldn't say they should stay in if that's the only reason, right? They shouldn't join the club if they aren't part of, right? That would not be the time, which actually relates to the next point, which is some people say, I know the first year of Yizkor I'm not really supposed to stay in. So where does that come from? So it happens to be that this is a debate in halacha, is that Yizkor is like a funny thing to have in Yom Tov as well, because Yom Tov is supposed to be a time v'samachta b'chagecha v'yisach samech. I know there's Seba Sukkos, but there's simcha by all of the Shalosh Regalim. It's extra simcha by Sukkos. You're supposed to be happy. When you go to Yizkor, it's not always so happy, right? So it's definitely very hard for rabbis preparing drushes who're supposed to give happy drushes at sad times. So how do you bridge the two? So that's why some poskim say for the first year you don't do Yizkor. Why not? Because the first year you don't want to be putting yourself into a place where one's going to be sad on a Yom Tov as well. Whereas other poskim say no, the default is one should do it. I would say that the default is the opinion that one should say it even the first year, because what will happen? The person's going to say, okay, it's during my year of Avelus, and now I'm going to be going. I'm not going to stay in for Yizkor because I don't want to get upset. Right? But then they're going to stand outside them saying to themselves, I'm really upset that I'm not going in to say the Yizkor I know I should really be doing. So they get more upset at the fact that they're... anyways, but nonetheless, so what I always say to people is, ask your parents, what did your father do the first yahrzeit they had? Right? And if they would stay in, then stay in. If you don't know, stay in. If they didn't stay in, then stay out. That would be the way to do it. Anyways, but it just happens to be there's a machlokes in the poskim, and so the tradition one should go with tradition. Yes, yeah.
I get confused every year when we do this. After saying all the Yizkor, it says the Kel Melei Rachamim. They look identical. They're all saying, "I'm going to give tzedakah." So do you choose one? Do you say both? Or
so most people do the Yizkor part. The Kel Melei is we usually give for the public. Right, but you're right. There is a private Kel Mali as well. They're achieving a similar type of goal. The Kel Mali is a little more elaborate in terms of what's being talked about. The Tzorah Chaim, Gan Eden, and so on as well. There is a minhag about a yahrzeit candle, and the custom is to light that yahrzeit candle during a Yom Tov. There is Yizkor before that Yom Tov. Now, it happens to be it's very useful to have a yahrzeit candle as well, in the fact that you need to light candles the next night in Chutz La'aretz. Right. So, that being the case, then that's also functional, which is very helpful, because let's say a person didn't light a yahrzeit candle. So would a person be able to light a yahrzeit candle on Yom Tov itself? So here's the interesting thing, is that technically speaking, 5 melachos on Yom Tov are allowed. 5 melachos on Shabbos are dispensed with when it comes to Yom Tov, and they are, just out of curiosity, do people know what's the difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov? Okay, Bishul, good. That should be the most obvious. Good. What? So Lisha, what was that? Lisha kneading, Shchita, Havara, and Haitzah. Right. So those are the 5 halachos that are dispensed with during on Yom Tov as well. Happens to be there needs to be some degree of tzorech, right? Now, even though there's a principle of what's called mitoch shehut l'tzorech, chutz gam shelo l'tzorech, that even though it needs to be for the need of Yom Tov, and because it was mutar for the need of Yom Tov, it's now, even when it's not directly the need of Yom Tov, that's the way person like Beis Hillel and Gemara and Beitza. So generally those melachos are all right, even if it's not the immediate need of Simchas Yom Tov. But we need to have a tzorech ksas. We need to have a little bit of a need. So the question becomes: Is lighting a yahrzeit candle on Yom Tov? So I can't light it from a match. That's moilid. I can light it from an existing flame because that's havara and that's right. The question is it letzorech? So that was just an interesting discussion in halacha. So the Mishnah Berurah actually talks about this. Simon Reish Samach, at the beginning of Hilchos Shabbos, where he says that let's say there's halachas of certain things you can do in bein hashmashos. You can tell a non-Jew to do certain things during bein hashmashos that are letzorech. And one of them, he says, is to light the yahrzeit candle you forgot. Why is it letzorech? He says because the person needs it for their own personal, emotional experience of Yom Tov and the Yizkor having a yahrzeit candle. So that isn't that interesting? Is that itself is a need? But most of the poskim say that if one, let's say, did not light a yahrzeit candle, one can take it from an existing flame and put it in a place where it's helpful. Meaning put it in the place where you eat, because then it's also serving the function of sharing light as well. Just an interesting combination of this particular idea as well. How many candles? Some Ashkenazim, I see it's more in the Hasidic community. Shlomo, tell me if this is correct. Multiple candles per person, right? Whereas the Sfardim do one candle for all the people as well. But it just becomes, sometimes it just gets a little much, because people are talking about great-grandparents and, right, there's more yahrzeit candles than there are Shabbos candles. And I don't know. But nonetheless, there seems to be a little bit of a divergence in minhag as well. Over here. Now let's just jump to the end of the year quickly, because I want to go do a quickly some mitzvahs. Hakamas matzeva. Hakamas matzeva means establishing or putting up the matzeva. So when is this done? So in Israel, it's done chik-chak, mamish 1, 2, 3. At the end of Shiva, you'll see it's already taken care of. Like I can't imagine an extra added stress during the Shiva. It's like figuring out what to or not to say. But in Israel, of course, there's less said in general. It's like it's a standardized thing. It's not a process. It's not a ritual. It's just like let's get it out there. Some people have the minhag to do it at the Shloshim, whereas the predominant minhag in Chutz La'aretz certainly and among the Ashkenazim is 12 months. Part of the reason for the 12 months is because we know that the Gemara tells us that after 12 months is the time when the mace is nishtakach min alayv. Now that does not mean to say that people forget. What it means to say is that it's not as imminent in our minds all the time. It's on the periphery all the time, but it's not that person's not there immediately all the time, which means to say that at such a time when that 12-month margin is being reached, we make a marker as going forward. So that's part of what it is. But more than that as well is there's also an element of ad hakamas matzeva. There's eulogy. You think back, and sometimes more coherently and incandescently than at the funeral, because that's a time of trauma, and sometimes people forget completely what the experience was like. So at that point, you're not supposed to give eulogies after 12 months. So it's supposed to be within. So trying to get it in those 12 months or the very edge it would be an appropriate time as well for this as well. So how to go about this? So it depends. So you'll look at different parts of the cemetery and you'll see there's very different styles of tombstones, right? So in the Russian side, they got the whole picture going there on the black marble, right? It's quite something. And then in other areas, it's really very short. In other areas, you have long descriptions and acrostics and all kinds of things. So you got to be consistent, right? You don't want to make a tombstone that's got like a Megillas Esther on it and everybody else has got 2 lines. It's not appropriate, right? It's not appropriate to doing that and that thing. Because what it does is it highlights this person in stone, and everybody around there was all right just with, and vice versa. If people all have acrostics in this particular section, that's the style of the particular chevra that it was bought in. It should be consistent. So just first thing is to notice what type of kvarim are around, and certainly if it's a shared tombstone with a spouse, then it should be parallel. It should be similar as well. But having said that, there are certain basics which need to exist. So at the top there always needs to be pei nun, which is poi nitman or nikbar. Here lies interred, and the Hebrew name needs to be there. And usually people put also the date of Petira. And then at the bottom is Taf Nun, Tzadi, Beis, Hey, Tehei, Nafshoy, or Nafshot, Tzura, B'tzura, Achayim, that their soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. And that's the most basic that it needs to be. More than that, unnecessary. Right? That's really what it is. But today we've got such gedolim, everybody's such a Gadol B'Yisrael. So, and it's cheaper. And we have more money to be able to do this. So therefore becomes a thing, right? So now everybody is a Rashka Bahag, right? It's like mamish, it's a beautiful thing. But at the same time, it's just it's amazing. Because this actually happened. Reb Chaim of Brisk, when he passed away, he was makpid. He said he only wanted to have one statement on his tombstone. That was, he was the Rav of Brisk. That's what he said. That's what he wanted to do. Happened to be that his tombstone was destroyed. I don't know which point in time it was during World War II or not. So when they reestablished Chaim's tombstone, they have this now elaborate thing and about Chidushei Torah and this and that. That wasn't what he wanted. But you look at the new tombstone, it's like there's the elaborate long he wanted it to be known that he cared about people in Brisk. That was what he felt was the most important thing that encapsulated everything else he did in his life. And so for today, that's the kind of we've had that movement where we have so many appellations. So they need to be first thing, they need to be accurate because there's no erasing, right? So it's a very great disservice to the person to exaggerate in stone about them because that'll cause din about them as well. One needs to be accurate. But usually there'll be an appellation. It could be Baal, Av, Saba, Yakar, as an example, like a beloved, husband, father. Grandfather, as an example, could have something like this, and then people like to have acrostics. So, like, you'll take the name, and then you'll try to get phrases that relate to this. Could be based on psukim, could be based on the ideas that their lives in it, and it's a particular skill. Not everybody knows how to do this, and it's worthwhile. I was speaking to a rabbi who knew the person, or was close to the family. And I just a lot of times, just this last week with somebody, you just sit down and you listen, what are the characteristics, what are the values they lived for? And what should that look like in their name, right? How do we do this? And it's a beautiful thing to be able to do this in an appropriate fashion, in a way that is becoming and befitting of the person as well. And there is a discussion about English. Some people feel that it's inappropriate in halacha, if you look at the poskim, to have any English whatsoever on the tombstone. But some people say, I want the grandchildren to understand that, and I want them to be able to know that this at least their name, right, as well, is there as well. Some people like to put the birth date as well as the patira date as well. So there are also additions in this as well, in this area as well. I think the acrostic is definitely valuable. I just recently I asked somebody if I could help them, and they said, oh no, we took care of it already, which is great. But then they sent me this whole thing, and it was just like a lot of lines about this person, like a very, very long. And I was like, it's just, you gotta know what's appropriate as well. Like when you go to Beth David here, so there's a lot of really big people buried in Beth David. Rav Eliyahu Henkin is buried there. You can go visit his kever. It's like 20 minutes from here, 25 minutes from here. Also Rav Herschel Schachter, Rav J.J. Schachter's father, who was the chaplain who liberated Buchenwald, is there as well. So that's a very serious tombstone, right? But then again, he lived a very serious life, right? So it makes sense, but it has to be commensurate to the types of life led, which as well. Is there a ceremony around Hakamas Matzevos? In Eretz Yisrael, Bichlal not. In Eretz Yisrael, it's like, before you even get there, it's there. It's like it's 1, 2, 3. But in Chutz La'aretz, there is a practice around this, and there are a lot of things which are related to this. So, for instance, there's certain Tehillim which should be said. There's reading the tombstone which should be said. There's a eulogy. There's a Malei Rachamim. There's a lot of things that go with it, and if done well, it can be very, very meaningful. If done correctly, there's Kufiyot Tes. You say the letters of the name. There's a lot of things. There's Psukim in Yeshayahu. When you come to, there's a lot of things that should be said, and it should be done correctly. A lot of times, it's a very private affair, so people do this very small. They don't even have a rabbi. So what I do is I created a guide just for people to do this, because let's say people say we're doing this. So I would say, here, I took the time, I took the hours to put together what it should look like. Here's the tefillos that should be said. And I send it to people because it's important that people know what's going on. Does the minyan need to be there? Technically speaking, no. But it's a beautiful thing if you're able to say Kaddish, right? If one's able to say, one can only say that if there's a minyan as well. And the Hakamas Matzevos should not be done on a day one does not say Tachnun. So one has to think carefully about planning that as well. People like Sunday mornings because that's convenient, but one has to think, is that Sunday morning, like next Sunday morning as an example, is Rosh Chodesh. That would not be an appropriate time to do Hakamas Matzevos as well, so one has to plan and such as well. In terms of the putting up the tombstone, there's a lot of reasons why this is. So first of all, it's called a Tzion. In fact, if you look at the Gemara says that in Adar, the Beis Din had the responsibility of what's called Metzayin es HaKfaros, which means to say they would take white limestone and they would just put it around the graves. That would be a responsibility of the community representatives invested in Beis Din. Why would that be the case? So that's for Shlomo, for the Kohanim, right? Yitzchak, for the Kohanim, right? So is that you need to make sure Eliezer. Right, so the Kohanim are not allowed to enter into Beis HaKfaros, Hilchos Tumah V'Tara, Tumas Kohanim, and so therefore the basic responsibility of a Tzion by a kever is for the notion of of Tum and Tara, and also appropriate behavior in that place. However, there's more to it than that as well, and that is that it's also called a matzeva, standing stone. There's in the Darash Moshe, Rav Moshe's commentary on Chumash. People say it's the Drash. I think it's Darash Moshe is the correct way to say it. There's no vowels on the cover of the Sefer, but that's what I believe it is. So Rav Moshe writes that we're not allowed to set up a matzeva today, right? We have to have a mizbeach, not a matzeva, right? The Torah says Asher Sanei Hashem Lekoch, Hashem hates. So Rav Moshe points out that at the end of life we're allowed a matzeva, because a matzeva is in a certain sense standing, complete, existent. No, there's no movement, right? So at the end of life you're allowed to look back and so stand and gain perspective. During life, that's not the time. That's not our modality of service. We're not in a place of retrospect and look what I've gained. That life is the Adam Omal Yula. There's no stopping. The treadmill just keeps going faster, right? So that's the matzeva is the end of life. So there's an element of that, but there's also the element, very famously, where you take a rock. Why a rock? Because a rock is Evan, which is a notricon for Av ben Neched, also Ima bas Nechta. Right, so it's the notion of continuity. It's something which is going to be there for Laman Yamdu Yamim Rabim. There's going to be a long time, and it's a way of establishing the continuity of the soul and the continuity of those who are representing and living the life that this person wanted. In fact, if you look in the Mishnah, one of the words for a tombstone is a nefesh. There's three words, right? There's tzion, matzeva, and nefesh. In English, it's this tombstone. Okay, it's like a meaningless word. But in the Mishnah, it's tzion, matzeva, and nefesh. Why nefesh? Nefesh is the lowest part of the soul. So there's nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, echida. So nefesh is the lowest part of the soul. And so let me say that part of the soul is tethered there. Part of the soul is there, which is why the Gemara in Brachos, what it says, do the Mesim know what's happening in this world? The only place that they were able to have this experiment was in the Beis HaKvaros, right? There was a Rosh Hashanah where the fellow went to the Beis HaKvaros and was talking and he heard two souls conversing, but it was in the Beis HaKvaros. Because in the Beis HaKvaros is where the nefesh is at certain times, right? So, but the point is that there's an element of the person who is there. And that's also part of what it is so to speak, a homing beacon or for that as well. A few other pieces over here. So yahrzeit, and we'll try to finish with this quickly. So yahrzeit, what does the word yahrzeit mean? Right? Everybody says yahrzeit. Everybody talks about this. It's called. It literally is the time of year, and in Hebrew it's called Yom Hashana. That's the way it's called as well. We've adopted the Yiddish expression, which is great, but it's the Yom Hashana. It's the day of the year as well. Now, when is it set? It's set usually from the day of death. Right, the day of Patira is going to be the yahrzeit. That's the time of year. However, it's worthwhile to note that it's not always that, and that is based on the fact that the first year may sometimes be different in Ashkenazi tradition, because the Ramah is the one who talks about this, and that is that let's say there's a gap between the death and the burial, then the first year's yahrzeit may act differently. Why is that? So let's take for example a 3-day gap. So let's say, and this is common, let's say that a person needs to get to Israel, right? And the Patira was on a Friday. So by the time, right, so Friday's not happening, Shabbos is not happening. Let's say they manage to get the Motzei Shabbos flight and they get in, right? And now it depends if it's the winter or the summer, when the burial is going to happen on the Sunday. Is it before or after Shkia? Well, we're talking about a significant delay, and there was no alternative, right? There was no alternative to this. So now comes the first year. So in the first year, the yahrzeit, according to Ashkenazi tradition, will be on the day of the burial, not the day of the yahrzeit. And then it reverts, it snaps back to day of Patira. Why is that? So the answer is because there's a convergence of two things. There is the yahrzeit and there's the avelos. Avelos is counted from the day of burial, always, right? So if there's a 3-day delay, now the avelos has actually started late. It started later than usual. That being the case, the avelos will actually extend beyond the actual day of death the next year. So let's use an example. Let's say in our example, Friday was Aleph, let's say Aleph Nisan, right? And then, actually, let's use Sivan, because Sivan was just this constellation. Let's say the death was on Aleph Sivan, right? And then Shabbos was Beis, Sunday was Gimel, and they only get buried at the night of Sunday, which is really Daled, right? So let's say Dalet is the day of burial of Sivan. It's not a Yeshana Uberes, so let's just say it's the full year. 12 months later, when is the Averos going to be finished? On Gimel Sivan, right? That's 12 months later. The end of Gimel Sivan is the completion of 12 months of Averos. However, if you're going to say that our yahrzeit would be Aleph Sivan, which was when the Patira was, then people will be observing the yahrzeit on Aleph Sivan, but they already have 2 more days of Avelos, which they will probably dispense with because they think, I kept the yahrzeit, so therefore the Avelos is ended, but it hasn't. Usually it converges. Why? Because let's say the situation was that Aleph Sivan was the Patira and Beis Sivan was the burial. Let's assume it's not a Shabbos situation. That's the most common situation. So then, if the burial was on Beis Sivan, then the Avelos will go till when? Aleph Sivan. When's the yahrzeit? Aleph Sivan. Great. So the yahrzeit finishes, the Avelos finishes the same time. Everything is easier. Shalom al Yisrael, much easier. When you have gaps, that's when the problem exists. So if a 3-day gap, very clear that the first year goes after the day of burial. What about the second? What about if it's a 2-day gap? There happens to be a machlokas because it's complicated. The Shach who talks about this in Yoredea infers differently in the same Shach as to whether 2 days is like 3 days or 1 day. Happens to be machlokas aposkim. I advise that. Based on the Rav Moshe, that people should treat it like 3 days, like a bigger gap, and go after the day of burial, not the day of Patira, because it has the same problem, which is the 1-day lag in terms of the Averos as well. Okay. Then Shalom Uberes, we talked about when the yahrzeit goes, and that should happen as well. Now, what happens spiritually on the yahrzeit? Like what is actually happening? So there's a lot. The Likutei Halachos talks about this that on such a day, the memory of the person comes in front of Kaddish Baruch Hu for din, and so therefore the possibility of elevating the station of the neshama is more on that day, right? Because there's a review, the files are opened, right? So it's a time when one stands for more of an aliyah. So therefore one tries to do more actions for that person. So what should a person do? So for a man, there's more to do. Coming in the Shabbos beforehand, what does that mean? Is it's possible to get the minhag is to try to get an aliyah to the Torah, if possible, maftir and Haftarah, if possible. The Gabaim know this is not always possible because not everybody can do that. What was that?
Many people think it's possible.
Many people think yes, exactly. Self-awareness is a very important attribute in life. Then also to do kel maleh. It's interesting. It seemed to be, if you look at the early halacha, it seemed to they used to do a kel maleh after the aliyah on Shabbos morning or in the day. And even the Ezra's Torah Luach seems to talk like that. But it seems to be that our practice today is always Shabbos afternoon is when we do the Kel Maleh. It's just interesting. Seems to have changed a little bit. And then also if the person is able to daven one of the tefillos, specifically Musaf, but like again, everybody needs to know, Yodeh Adam Nefesh Behemtoi, you need to know how good one is and everybody else is suffering at the same time while you're rendering, right? So it has to be that there's a self-awareness that if one's not able to daven there for Shabbos and everybody is listening, do Pesukah Zimra or Shabbos Mincha. That's a big schus too. And there is a minhag to daven on Motzei Shabbos of the week of the yahrzeit. And that used to be the reason why we had multiple minyanim, right? But then if you go into all these multiple minyanim on Motzei Shabbos, there's no one there who's davening for the Amud. It's just more really to get out, faster without a rabbi being there. But nonetheless, I'm just saying it as it is. But it's fascinating. It's fascinating because actually the halacha of the reason why on Motzei Shabbos that during the year of Avelos a person should be davening for Motzei Shabbos is because Shabbos is a reprieve of din on Shabbos, right? So on Motzei Shabbos, as the neshama is being reintroduced into din, that's when there specifically is important to daven for the Amud. It's just always fascinating because if you look in the Shulchan Aruch says so therefore you should try to do that later because that's the biggest chus, right? Meaning daven later, which is why I always wanted. It's so funny that everybody's running to the early minyan to daven for the person to bring them back to din. It's like it's always a fascinating thing. If you want to daven for somebody who's chus, take out Shabbos a little later. That's really much better for them. So that's part of this as well. Now on the day of the yahrzeit, there's a lot of practices which are important. The first is lighting a yahrzeit candle. Okay, and part of the reason is that is it's a reminder to those who are around. It's a reminder to those who see it that this is a special day to act appropriately. It doesn't have a magical association. It's a psychological association. And then to try to daven all the tilos l'amud if one's a man, to say the Kaddishim. There's Kriyas Torah, one should get an aliyah that day if it's possible. Learning more Torah is very important on the yahrzeit, specifically Mishnayos. There's a list of Mishnayos which have the acronym of the person's name. Also, their last parak in Mikvos, 7th parak of Mikvos, has the last 4 Mishnayos of the letters Neshama in them as the acronym. One should try to do that as well. If one is able to visit the grave of the on the day of the yahrzeit, and possible to light a candle, if you go through, let's say, cemeteries now, you'll see in some cemeteries in the Hasidic sections they have silver boxes. Right, the silver boxes are for yahrzeit candles. It's just not easy to light candles and burn down, cemeteries if you don't have a place to light it. The Hasidic sections, I know there's a fellow in this community who goes to Europe to put yahrzeit boxes at Kivrei Tzadikim. Really interesting. That's his project. But that comes to putting a candle there and specifically giving stock and merit to the person's soul. And saying so, and if let's say one pledged it, one should redeem it as soon as possible. So it shouldn't be saying like, I'll give stock of bli neder and then 6 months later remembering it. It's trying to do it as soon as possible. And it's ideal to have a meal or a tikkun. The Sephardim have a meal, the Ashkenazim do a tikkun. Tikkun is just really you bring a little bit of food, schnapps, herring in the good days, and everybody says a bracha for the person's neshama as well, on this as well. Are there aspects of Avelos? Most people don't know this. But yes, there is. There's one aspect of Avelos which is true on the yahrzeit, and that is that a person should not go to a chasna, a wedding, on the night of the yahrzeit. That's what the Ramah says. Most people are not aware of this. Other simchas, bar mitzvahs, vorts, sheva brachos, that's fine. A wedding on the night is an issue, and it happened to me once. The people were not understanding. Rabbi, how could you not? I'm like, it says, but it's that's the one aspect of Avelos, and yes, so there is another aspect of fasting. So that's the next point I pointed is that actually fasting is a thing. That's the next question. Is fasting is supposed to be the way to do it, and that's talked about the kol boy and all the earlier the halacha. That's the biggest thing seems to be fasting, but today. Many of the poskim, if you look in the Nitzei Gabriel, there's a long list. Rocham Kanievsky, Rosh Hashanah, all talk about the fact that fasting today is more detrimental. If we're just going to be in a decaffeinated, angry state all day long, and like be in a space where one's more irritable and less pleasant to be around, then one's not generating much good for that person. Which comes to the last part is like, let's say a person wasn't able to do any of this. The person wasn't able to get this. The Amud was taken. They didn't do then. They tell a story of Rav Yisrael Salanta who came to shul on yahrzeit, and there was a person who had also come to shul that day who had lost a child, right? Now, a person who loses a child is not a chiyuv in the same way as a person who lost a parent, ironically, right? It's just in terms of taking the amud. So, technically speaking, Rav Yisrael Salanta had the rights to the amud. Now, technically speaking, is a bad way to start any argument, right? Because, especially when it comes to emotional things, because you're never going to come out on top, right? So Rav Yisrael Salanta gave the amud to this person, and when people said, "But we know it's your yahrzeit, how could you do this?" He says, "I'm generating much more zchus for my parents than by giving this person who's in an emotional, painful state the amud than I would by taking the amud and being technically correct as well." Which is a very big klal to be aware of when it comes to this, which actually relates very similarly to what the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says as well. Where after giving all the halachas of Kaddish, it's Siman, I think it's Chavav in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says it's much more important than Kaddish, is living a life which is al pi yasher, is living a life which is reflective of all the values of Torah in the way that we live. And he says so much so, he suggests that people before their passing should tell their children to do a particular mitzvah or to live a life of yasher, so that every time that a person's doing such, that living is a schus to the neshama much more than a particular kaddish as well. But it's important to acknowledge the reason why this is so difficult is because around the time of a yahrzeit, everybody always feels agitated, right? Now, it's important to articulate that, is that around yahrzeits, we feel like we ought to be doing more. We need to be doing more for the person, and we haven't done enough, and we haven't lived up to, and those are the kind of feelings that happen in a person's heart, which is why people get much more particular around yahrzeits to do all these things, because they want to. But within that particularity, within that hakpada, it should be, the hakpada is also giving space to others as well. That's also part of it as well. Just to realize that other people can exist. It doesn't have to be that there are casualties to one's hakpara for that other person as well. So this sort of frames the whole idea. I put most of these questions over here. I left a few other questions I didn't address, but Be'ezra Hashem for future.